Chapter 9, May 20, 1862. The moon was curtained with thick clouds. Wind rustled the willow trees along the Chickahominy. Now and then came the faint grumble of far-off cannon fire. A rowboat slipped silently through the dark, pieces of blanket tied around the oars to keep them from splashing. When the boat reached the opposite bank, a heavy, middle-aged woman climbed out. She waved to the oarsman. He raised a hand in salute, turned his boat, and headed back to the far shore. The woman, carrying a wicker basket, looked around to get her bearings. She knew from maps that the great Chickahominy swamp was on her left. If she followed its edge through the woods, she'd reach a dirt road winding away from the river. With a nod, the woman started off. Her long skirt made walking through the underbrush difficult, and branches snagged the basket she carried. After a mile or so, she found the road, a dim gray band in the darkness. Here she would stay until dawn. Then she'd head for the Confederate lines. The tired woman sat down and leaned gratefully against a tree. Emma Edmonds, alias Franklin Thompson, alias Cuff the contraband slave, was now an Irish peddler named Bridget O'Shea. Her new disguise and cover story had been carefully worked out in the chaplain's cabin. "I can't go back as Cuff," Emma had explained to Mrs. Butler. "Remember that rebel officer left me standing guard duty. If Cuff showed up, he might be recognized. They could arrest him for deserting his post." Mrs. Butler nodded, and the two friends lapsed into silence. Suddenly, the older woman jumped up, hurried into the bedroom, and came back dragging an old campaign trunk. "I brought a deal of fancy clothes with me from Baltimore," she said. "Lord knows I can't use them in this rough place, but you can." Together they rummaged through the trunk, and soon Emma was transformed from an ordinary soldier into a plump, bossomy matron. Mrs. Butler tied a pillow around Emma's middle for bulk. Then came a petticoat, a fancy blouse, and a heavy skirt that reached the floor. Over all of this went a sweater and a fringed shawl. Mrs. Butler dusted flour in Emma's dark hair to turn it gray, and then tied a big bonnet on her head. She stood back and studied her results. "One more touch," she announced. Poking in her sewing box, she found her extra pair of metal-rimmed eyeglasses and perched them on Emma's nose. "Perfect," she said. "Let them slide a bit and look over the top." To complete the disguise, Emma filled a basket with peddler's goods for the Southern soldiers: spools of thread, needles, matches, a pair of scissors, pieces of soap, corn cakes, and packets of tea. Looking at herself in Mrs. Butler's mirror, Emma grinned. She liked the overall effect. Thousands of Irish immigrants had recently come to America, fleeing the terrible potato famine. Many had settled in this part of the country, so it was a safe cover. If anyone asked questions, she'd say she was from Providence Forge and had left a few jumps ahead of the advancing Yankees. Now, having reached the winding road, Bridget O'Shea settled down to wait for morning. The humming of the wind made her drowsy, and she quickly dozed off. At first light she awoke, feeling stiff. The wind had risen sharply, and the sky was thick with clouds. A storm was coming. Rising to her feet, Bridget twitched her skirt in place and started on her way. Fat drops of rain began to fall, making small circles in the dust. Soon the rain was coming down heavily. The peddler trudged through the mud, trying to stay under the trees along the road, but the wind whipped the rain sideways, drenching her. Coming around a bend, she saw an old frame house up ahead. There were no lights, and it appeared to be abandoned. She quietly climbed the steps, carefully opened the door, and slipped inside. The house was deserted. The floor sagged. There was no furniture, and the walls were streaked with ancient dirt. Grateful to have a roof over her head, Bridget pulled off her bonnet and soggy shawl. Lord, what a downpour! What a bother! Suddenly she froze. Someone was groaning in the next room. Creeping to the doorway, she peeked inside. A soldier lay on the bare floor, a Confederate officer. He appeared to be no more than a boy, and she could tell he was very sick. Kneeling at his side, she touched his forehead. He was burning up, his breath coming in gasps. His pulse was weak, and there were red blotches on his face. Bridget knew the symptoms. She'd seen them often enough in camp. Typhoid fever was a killer that took no sides. In both armies, the disease was doing more harm than all the bullets, swords, and shell fire. The young man stirred. "Water." In the kitchen, Bridget found some old crockery on a shelf. She filled a cup from the pump and hurried back to the soldier. The man drank thirstily and fell back gasping. He clutched at her hand. "Thank you, Aunt." The soldier's kit lay beside him. Bridget pulled out the blanket, folded it, and tucked it under the young man's head. Then she sat down near him. She was a firm believer in duty. Military orders were important, but this was important too. Rebel or not, she couldn't walk away and let him die alone. She'd have to stay and keep vigil, though she didn't think it would be for very long. All morning Bridget O'Shea sat with the dying boy. She tore a wide strip from her petticoat, moistened it, and placed the cool pad on his forehead. He reached for her hand again. She held his hand and sang to him, old hymns and lost lullabies she dimly remembered from childhood. There wasn't much else she could do. She gave him more water, and in the afternoon she stirred a fire in the iron stove and made tea for them both. She also shared corn cakes with her companion, though he could eat little. The tea revived him briefly. He raised himself on one elbow and stared at his guardian curiously. Had he somehow seen through her disguise? Well, it didn't matter. There was nothing he could do now. The soldier was sinking. His voice came in gasps and whispers, and bit by bit she heard his story. Allen Hall was a lieutenant in a Virginia rifle company. He'd been ill for weeks with typhoid and had tried to carry on. 2 days before, at Cold Harbor, his men had fought a battle with an advanced Union force. The Virginians retreated, but Hall was too sick to keep up with them. Afraid of falling into enemy hands, he dragged himself off through the woods, where he'd found this house, and managed to crawl inside. For a time he slipped into a coma. Later he roused himself. "Aunt," he whispered, "if you ever pass through the Confederate camp this side of Richmond, ask for a Major McKee of General Ewell's staff. There's a gold watch in my pocket. Please give him the watch. He'll know who it should be sent to." The boy's eyes were glassy. "Tell the Major. Oh, just say I had a mind to go home." Bridget O'Shea kept her vigil as the day faded into darkness. Outside the storm raged. Rain drummed on the windows, thunder growled. Somewhere in the house a loose shutter went slap, slap, slap. And, above it all, the wind moaned, keening for dying troopers. Bridget stood up and stretched. Her back and shoulders ached. She walked to the window, stared at nothing, and went back to her soldier. She was feeling restless and weary. The sounds of the storm rising and falling slowly created their own music. A new hymn was making the rounds of the Union camps, a song written only a few months before by a Boston woman named Howe. Emma had found the stanzas printed in a magazine called the Atlantic Monthly, and she'd heard it sung around the Union campfires. The glorious words were captivating, resounding in the drumming of horses' hooves, the rattle of caisson wheels, the blare of bugles, and the crash of guns. Alone with her dying soldier, she heard them again in the sounds of the wind. "He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored," Lieutenant Hall muttered in delirium. She bathed his face with a cool cloth. Sitting against the wall, she held his thin hand and willed him some of her strength. "He has loosened the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword." She wondered when, if ever, this fearful war would end. A friend of the Butlers had just come from Washington. He told them President Lincoln had aged 10 years over the past few months. "He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat." Now they were dying, the fine boys of both armies. Gallants, Lincoln had called the brave and early fallen. "He is shifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat." Darkness finally came, and Bridget O'Shea slept fitfully. She dozed on and off, haunted by painful dreams. In the gray light of morning, the young man was dead. For a while she sat there, unable to move. With an effort she roused herself, found the gold watch, and put it in her basket. Then she covered the soldier with his blanket and said a silent prayer. She'd find Major McKee for him if it was the last thing she ever did. Gathering her belongings, Bridget left the house, closing the door gently behind her. According to her reckoning, the rebels would be several miles farther to the west. She headed slowly down the road, sidestepping the worst of the puddles. The rain had long since stopped, but her face was wet. She reached up and brushed the tears away. Devil take this ugly war. It was brutal and cruel, yet she knew the Union had to survive. For her, that was all that mattered. It was the one thing she could believe in. She willed herself to stop thinking of young Lieutenant Hall. He was at peace now, but she still had work to do. At headquarters, Colonel Shrub had shown her the secret battle map stuck with its colored pins. "This area's a question mark," he said, pointing a stubby finger at one spot. "Your mission, Thompson, is to find out what's going on here. We must know the tricks they're up to." In her mind, Bridget reviewed her orders, all the details and all the dangers, and fear began to creep in. Could she really carry it off? Would the disguise work this time? Would her luck hold, or was she tempting fate? "Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. His day is marching on." She brushed aside her morbid thoughts. Bother the risks. She wasn't a timid peddler woman. She was a Union soldier, and proud of it. Bridget O'Shea set her chin, wiped her nose, yanked her bonnet straight, and pushed on toward the enemy lines.